Nobody was laughing the afternoon Denny Hartwell drove out to the Pruill property on the Notasulga Road in Macon County, Alabama, and saw what was inside the barn. But they had been laughing for the better part of 2 years before that, and it is worth saying so plainly, because that is the part of the story that explains the rest of it. Denny Hartwell ran the Hartwell Feed and Farm Supply on the east side of Tuskegee, had been running it since 1988, and in that time had seen most of what Macon County had to show him. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He said later, and he said it without any apparent discomfort about what it implied, that when Marcus Pruill first started coming into the store asking about horseshoes, he hadn't thought much of it. A 16-year-old boy asking about old horseshoes. Denny had pointed him toward the back shelf where they kept a bin of used ones and left him to it. He had not asked what the boy was planning. It had not occurred to him to ask. He was sorry about that later. Not guilty, exactly. Just sorry he'd missed the beginning of it. Somebody had to write this one down or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second and subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. Tuskegee sits at the western edge of Macon County in east-central Alabama, in a part of the state where the soil runs red clay deep and the summers are long, and the history sits on everything like weather, in the names of the roads, in the fence lines that mark land, that changed hands in ways people don't often discuss at the feed store, in the way certain families are known, and certain families are not. It is the kind of place where what a man's grandfather did still matters when people are trying to figure out who a man is. Where you come from is part of your introduction, whether you offer it or not. The Pruill family had been in Macon County since before anyone then living could trace it clearly. They were not prominent people in the public sense. They owned a house on 4 acres off the Notasulga Road, kept a garden, kept a few chickens, and went to the same church they had gone to for 3 generations. Marcus's grandfather, a man named Elias Pruill, had spent 40 years as a farrier and part-time blacksmith working farms and stables across Macon, Lee, and Tallapoosa counties. He had shod horses for everyone who asked, and a few who hadn't been planning to, until someone pointed them toward him. He was known for his work the way a quiet man gets known, not loudly, not by his own promotion, but through the slow-moving testimony of people who had watched that work hold up for years. He had a forge in a barn on the back of the family property that he had built himself in 1968, modified off a design in an old Auburn University agricultural bulletin, and he had used that forge for going on 40 years, until his hands gave out in 2007 and his eyes made close work difficult. He didn't talk much about stopping. He just stopped, the way men of that type stop things, without ceremony and without complaint. Elias Pruill died in March of 2009, when Marcus was 14 years old. He left the forge, the tools, and a handwritten price ledger going back to 1971 to his grandson, who was the only person in the family who had spent real time in that barn, watching him work. Marcus had started going out to the forge barn when he was 9 years old, initially because his grandfather let him pump the bellows, which was a satisfying job for a 9-year-old with good arms and no patience for sitting still. And then later, because he had begun to understand that something real was happening in that barn, and he wanted to be closer to it. Elias Pruill did not teach formally. He did not explain a principle and then demonstrate it. He worked, and he talked while he worked, and if Marcus was there and listening, he got the benefit of the talking. And if he wasn't there, he didn't. Marcus was almost always there. Elias talked about heat. He talked about it the way other men talked about weather, constantly, with nuance, with strong opinions about specific conditions. He told Marcus that iron had a color for every temperature, and that learning to read those colors in a particular fire, in a particular forge, with a particular grade of coal, was something that took time and could not be shortcut. Yellow-orange meant the iron was ready to move. Cherry red meant it wanted to move but would resist you. Black heat, iron that looked cool but wasn't, was where men got hurt and work got ruined. He said the fire told you what it was doing if you watched it the right way, and the iron told you what it wanted if you listened through the hammer. He taught Marcus how to draw out iron, how to lengthen a piece by moving it steadily under consistent hammer blows, working back from the tip, not fighting the metal but leading it. He taught him the difference between a shaping blow and a finishing blow. He showed him how to read a weld, how a good forge weld, when it took, went quiet under the hammer in a way a bad one didn't. He showed him how old horseshoes behaved differently from new bar stock, how they had a memory from their working life that you had to account for. He did not finish teaching. He died in March of 2009. 2 winters before Marcus felt ready to light the forge himself, and there were things in that barn Marcus could do with confidence, and things he was uncertain about, and things he knew he did not yet know at all. The forge weld was the uncertain one. The scroll work was the unknown. He could feel in the iron when the heat was right. He could not yet always make the iron do what he wanted when the heat was right. He had the tools. He had the ledger. He had 4 years of mornings in that barn. He decided it was enough to start on, and that the rest he would learn by doing it wrong until he got it right, which was, as far as he could tell from everything Elias had ever said about the trade, exactly how Elias had learned it too. He started by collecting horseshoes. The logic was straightforward, the way his grandfather's logic had always been straightforward. New iron cost money Marcus didn't have. Used horseshoes were iron that people were throwing away or letting rust in corners and fence posts and barn floors all over Macon County. A horseshoe was a known quantity. Consistent grade, consistent weight, shaped already into a curve that was useful to work from. Elias had used old horseshoes for small projects going back years, and Marcus had watched him do it. So Marcus began asking. He started a list in the back of his grandfather's ledger, not in the ledger pages themselves, which he left untouched, but on a blank end paper at the back of everywhere in the county he might find old horseshoes. He asked at the Hartwell feed store. He asked at the 2 working stables south of Tuskegee, where quarter horses were kept for trail riding and the occasional show. He asked at the Beasley farm east of Notasulga, one of the 2 operations in the county that still kept a pair of Belgian draft horses for specialty field work, and which went through shoes at a rate that meant a good supply of worn ones. He drove the county roads on his bicycle with a grain sack looped over the handlebars and stopped at fence posts where old shoes had been nailed up. A country habit that went back a long way, shoes nailed point down on fence posts for luck or custom, or both, the reason depending on who you asked. He knocked on doors and explained himself, and asked if he could take the shoes down. Most landowners said yes. A few wanted to know what he was planning to do with them. He told them he was going to work them on his grandfather's forge. He said it plainly and without elaboration, which was how Elias Pruell had always said plain things. Over the first 4 months, Marcus collected 211 horseshoes. He sorted them by size and condition in the barn, cleaned the worst of the rust off with a wire brush and white vinegar, and stacked them in wooden crates along the back wall. He did not start working them on the forge immediately. He spent the first month just getting the fire right again, learning the forge's specific character, which ran hot on the left side and wanted more air than he expected, and which rewarded patience in a way he had to relearn each time he thought he had it figured out. That was when some of the laughing started. Gary Odom had been the primary working farrier in the eastern part of Macon County for 11 years. A compact, weathered man who did good work and knew it, and was not shy about knowing it. He heard about the boy collecting horseshoes from 3 different sources inside about 2 weeks. The way things travel in a county that size. He ran into Marcus at the feed store one morning and asked him, not unkindly but not warmly either, what he thought he was going to do with a pile of old shoes and a forge he didn't know how to run. Marcus told him what he planned to make. Gary Odom looked at him for a moment. Then he said that what Marcus was describing took years to learn and that he was going to waste a lot of iron finding that out. He said it the way a man says something he considers a fair warning rather than a cruelty. He was not wrong about how long it took to learn. He was wrong about the waste. What Denny Hartwell saw when he drove out to the Proul property on a Saturday afternoon in October of 2012, about 22 months after Marcus had first come into the feed store asking about horseshoes, was this. The barn doors were open for the first time in what looked like a long time. The old wood swung back and pinned with iron hooks that Elias Pruell had forged himself sometime in the 1970s. The forge was going. You could smell the coal from 30 feet away, that particular clean, sharp smell of good forged coal burning hot, and you could see the glow of it through the barn doorway before you stepped inside. The anvil, a 212-pound Fisher Eagle that had been Elias Pruell's since 1974, its face worn smooth from decades of use, and its horn curved to a working point, sat in the middle of the barn floor on a hardwood stump. Marcus was standing beside it, finishing something with a handled wire brush, his back to the door. On 2 sawhorses against the back wall was the gate. Denny Hartwell was not a man who spent much time in forge shops or metalworking spaces. He sold feed and fencing and the occasional small tool, and his experience of ironwork was largely functional: hinges, latches, the hardware ends of things. He did not have a refined vocabulary for what he was looking at. But he knew when something had been made with extraordinary care, and he knew when something was finished to a standard that most things never reached. And what he was looking at against the back wall of that barn was both of those things. It was a decorative iron gate, 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, built entirely from reclaimed horseshoes that Marcus had collected, cut, heated, shaped, and forge welded into a pattern that ran in interlocking curves across the full face of the piece. The shoes were still recognizable in places, the gentle curve of the toe, the line of nail holes that every worn shoe carries, and in other places they had been heated and worked and drawn out until they had become something else. Flowing curves and tight scrolled ends and flat-faced joints so clean they looked machine-made until you got close enough to see the hammer marks, which were even and deliberate, and which were, in their own way, a kind of signature. The whole piece weighed approximately 90 pounds. It lay true in the plane. It did not sag at the joints or show any gap in the pattern where the design had not resolved. It had taken Marcus 4 months to build, working evenings after school and most of Saturday, with the barn doors shut, because he was not ready to show it to anyone until it was done. He had been through 3 failed attempts at the scroll work before he understood what the iron wanted from him at that particular temperature and that particular hammer weight. He had rebuilt 2 of the main horizontal members after deciding, on inspection, that they were not level to the standard he had set himself. He had spent $47 on coal and $23 on welding wire. Everything else in the gate had been given to him for free by people who thought they were giving him useless junk. He had not told anyone what he was building. Not his parents. Not Denny Hartwell. Not Gary Odom. His grandfather had taught him, by example rather than instruction, that the time to show a thing was when the thing was done, and not before. Denny Hartwell had come out to the property that Saturday to drop off a bag of feed that Marcus's mother had ordered, and that Denny had offered to deliver since he was driving the Nottasulga Road anyway. Marcus's mother had sent him out to the barn to tell Marcus someone was here, and Marcus had come out and said he could come in if he wanted to see something. Denny Hartwell stepped inside and stood there for what he later described as a long time, without saying anything. He walked the length of the gate, which was propped against the back wall of the barn on two sawhorses. He looked at the nail holes in the shoes. He looked at where Marcus had forge welded the joints. He looked at the overall pattern, and then looked at it again from the side to see the plane of it, whether it lay true. It lay true. He asked Marcus what he planned to do with it. Marcus said he planned to sell it. Denny asked what he thought it was worth. Marcus opened his grandfather's ledger, which was sitting on the workbench beside the forge, and showed Denny the 1987 entries, where Elias had priced decorative ironwork for 3 different clients in the county. He had adjusted those numbers forward for what he understood about how prices moved. He told Denny he thought the gate was worth $2,400. Denny Hartwell looked at the gate again. He said he thought that was probably low. Marcus sold the gate 3 weeks later to a farm property outside Auburn, a restored antebellum house whose owners had been looking for ironwork that matched the scale and period feel of the place, for $2,750. The buyers had found him through Denny Hartwell, who had mentioned what he'd seen in the barn to a woman who came into the feed store looking for a referral for custom metalwork. Denny had given her Marcus's name without hesitation, and without quite being able to explain, later, why it had felt so obvious. Marcus deposited the check at the Tuskegee branch of his family's bank on a Thursday afternoon, and then drove home and sat in the forge barn for a while without doing anything. Because he wasn't sure what to do next, and he wanted to think about it where the work had happened. He decided to build a pair of boot scrapers. The boot scrapers were smaller work, faster work, and gave him a chance to practice the scrollwork joints that had given him trouble during the gate build. He made them to order for a client in Opelika who had seen a photograph of the gate on a printed flyer Denny Hartwell had made. 1 sheet, black and white. No particular graphic design, just a photograph and a phone number, and pinned to his store bulletin board without asking Marcus's permission. Marcus did not mind. He sold the boot scrapers for $380 in 6 weeks. By the spring of 2013, he had a waiting list of 4 commissions: a second gate, a set of stair railings for a renovated farmhouse in Lee County, a fireplace screen, and a wall-mounted candle holder array for a restaurant in Auburn that had seen the fireplace screen commissioned by its owner's neighbor and wanted something similar. His projected gross for the calendar year was just under $14,000, all from reclaimed horseshoes, coal, and wire. He was 17 years old, and he had not yet spent $1 on raw iron. Gary Odom heard about the gate through the county. He heard about it from a farrier friend who had seen it at the Auburn property and called him about it. Odom drove out to the Pruill barn one evening and asked to see the forge and the work. Marcus showed him. Odom was quiet for a while. He looked at the anvil, which had been Elias Pruell's, and which he recognized. He had known Elias, had learned 1 or 2 things about fitting from watching him work a decade and more ago. He asked Marcus how much Elias had actually taught him. Marcus said his grandfather hadn't finished teaching him everything. He said he'd figured out the rest from the tools and the ledger and doing the work wrong until he started doing it right. Odom nodded slowly. He said that was how Elias had learned too, as far as he knew. He asked if Marcus would be willing to show him the forge weld technique on the gate joints, which he had not seen done that cleanly on reclaimed iron before. Marcus said he would. They spent about an hour at the forge that evening. Odom did most of the watching and Marcus did most of the talking, which was a reversal of how things had been between them 14 months earlier at the feed store, and neither one of them mentioned that. Denny Hartwell told the story at his store counter for years. He told it because he thought it deserved to be told. And because he felt some responsibility for not having asked the right question at the beginning, "What are you planning to do with those horseshoes?" when the answer might have changed how 2 years of quiet laughter in a small county had gone. He said he didn't know if it would have mattered to Marcus either way. He thought probably it wouldn't have. He thought Marcus Pruell was the kind of person who was going to build the thing regardless of whether anyone believed in it, because the belief wasn't something he needed from outside. He had his grandfather's tools and his grandfather's ledger and 2 years of watching a man do the work, and that was what he had built from. Elias Pruell never saw the gate. He had been gone 3 years by the time the first commission sold. He had spent 40 years in that barn doing work that the county needed and that not everyone appreciated, and that he did anyway, because iron was honest and the fire was honest, and the work told you what it was when you held it. He left the barn to the one person who would use it. He had known which one that was for a long time before he died. Some things you leave behind because you don't have a choice. Some things you leave behind because you know exactly who's going to pick them up. Elias Pruell knew. That was the whole of it.